Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all so much for being able to come to this Zoom class today. And so today I'm going to be talking about medicinal botany. So this is our last botany class for the time being. Next month, we're going to switch gears and we're going to focus on insects. Specifically, we're going to talk about spiders. And then in November, we're going to talk about moths. And then after that, I should have some other programs lined up for you to see. Of course, this is being recorded, and so if you would like to look at this at a later time, I do have it on the Hopkins County Extension Horticulture YouTube page. And this class may go a little bit longer today just because of all the subject matter. So if I do go over, I apologize. If you need to leave, that's totally understandable. And you can watch the rest of the recording later on. Um, but otherwise, let's go ahead and get started. So, of course, whenever we talk about these different botany classes, I think the big question is, what is medicinal botany? And first off, when we talk about botany itself, that's the scientific study of plants. And so with medicinal botany, of course, that would be the study of or the use of medicinal plants or herbs. We like to use the word herbs, although this could relate to even some of our more woody plant species as well. And just kind of focusing more on what are some of the more medicinal properties that are found in the different plants. And so I'm going to give you all kind of a brief history lesson. Actually, some of this you may have heard from in last month's class, but I'm going to give a little brief history, and then we're going to talk about using plants for medicinal purposes, and then we're going to actually kind of go more in depth on some plants and their intended uses. And so we will focus on kind of more international plants first, and then we'll go in on some of our native plants. So let's dive right into it. All right, so I mentioned this before, the De Materia Medica. So this was written by Dioscorides in 70 AD. And as I had mentioned, kind of like in the ethnobotany series, this is a really interesting piece of work where not only did it, kind of help to categorize and give actual physical records to some of the medicinal uses of plants, but it also kind of went in depth on if a plant looked like a particular organ of the body, like say lungwort looked like the shape of a lung, then a lot of people back then believed that it was to aid in different ailments of the lung. And so, of course, this is certainly not the case today. Just because a plant looks like, a human organ doesn't mean that it may actually be used to treat that organ. But those were kind of what people believed at that point in time. And over time, it's scientific research, it's trial and error to actually learn what these different plants are going to be used for. But this was a very big deal because, again, this was kind of this written component that had all of these plants classified with their different uses. So that was pretty significant, especially 2,000 years ago that we're looking at. And so this piece of, this booklet, if you will, really had plants such as aloe, poppies, henbane, aconite, different things that we recognize today. So yes, so this kind of goes in more in depth of what I was talking about. This is known as the doctrine of signatures, where you had plants that were resembling certain parts of the human body used to treat different ailments. So let's, mention a bloodroot, for example, the red sap that is found whenever it is wounded, was used to treat diseases of the blood. And as I said with liverwort, well, I had said lungwort, but for instance, liverwort used to treat the liver. So That just kind of gives you a good explanation as to what this was. But to go beyond that, when we're really looking at medicinal plants, how do plants become medicinal? Like, why are these compounds there in plants and how can they ultimately, impact or even benefit us as humans and animals as well? So to break that down, plants will produce chemical compounds, different types of chemical compounds. Of course, primarily these compounds are used as a defense against different types of diseases and insects. It might be used as a defense mechanism, okay? But what's interesting about this is that humans kind of discovered that some of these compounds that are, whether they're secreted, from the plant, or whatnot, that these actually have some positive healing effects on humans. And so humans kind of learn to, if you will, kind of with domesticating plants. I mean, they discovered again by trial and error what plants could help with what type of condition. And so they may have either started foraging this plant where they were found, or even eventually cultivating these plants for these medicinal purposes. And over time, of course, as we really started to develop scientifically, and we had industrialization, we started to actually use these compounds in modern day medicine. And with that, what's interesting to note is that 30 to 40% of our conventional drugs found today have some kind of, history, are originally created from the use of plants to some degree. So um, that's that's going to be some of the stuff that we talk about today. Is not just like you go out into the woods and this plant could like help heal your burn, but also what are some of these plants that whose compounds are extracted actually could be used in modern day medicine or treatments of different kinds of diseases or even in cancer research. So we'll talk about all of that here in a minute. So using plants for medicinal purposes. Of course, we have kind of your traditional wilderness remedies, for those of us who are big into foraging, and whether we're eating edible plants or we're using it to help treat different injuries, things of that nature. Sometimes we may even use the plants in teas as well to help aid with any kind of internal ailments that we have. And then, of course, kind of in with modernization, um, we have been able to extract a lot of these plants and create them into medicines, but also into supplements as well. And so we may use these supplements to help as part of our regular, routine. We may use these to help as a nutritional supplement if we feel like we're missing something like that in our diets. Now, of course, as I get into talking about these plants, I always want to use caution. First off, I'm not a doctor, and so I am not providing any medical advice. If you have questions about whether any of these plants might be used for different medicinal purposes or ailments, for any conditions you may have, you'll want to talk to them. Of course, a lot of times some of the plants that we mention, if they are consumed or used as an herbal supplement, they may interact with other medications that you are using. And so that is when you definitely need to seek out medical advice. So that's number one. And then, of course, number two is, even though I'm going to be talking about these plants, okay, you got to do your own research, your own due diligence, that if you're going to go out and kind of forage any of these plants, making sure that they're properly identified and also making sure they're actually safe to consume. Because here's the thing, a lot of the plants we're going to talk about today, although they're medicinal, the compounds are extracted from these plants, and it very well may be this teeny tiny minuscule amount of compound that's used, to the point where if you were to actually consume the whole plant or even a part of the plant, it might be too concentrated with that compound that it could be very, very toxic to you, and even in certain cases fatal. So just always be careful whenever you're going to be consuming plants of any kind. So that's my spiel for that. So let me move on. All right. So let's get into what you're really wanting to learn about today. So let's talk about, some of the different plants that we might see. And honestly, I really want to focus on plants that we see commonly in our gardens. Maybe they're ones that we purchase all the time. Um, and then what particular uses that they were involved with. So I'm going to focus on that first, and then we'll get into some of our native plants. So one example that I always like to use is our Madagascar periwinkle. So you may also know it by the common name vinca. So that's on the left-hand side here, the Casaranthus roseus. So this is one of our kind of almost common bedding plants, right? This is considered an annual flower. It does really well in full sun conditions, and it's a nice mounding plant that gives color. But did you know that this tiny little plant has actually been researched in the treatment of certain cancers, specifically leukemia? So, I guess I kind of should have started with this is it really is not only interesting, but almost miraculous when you think about all of these plants and their uses, and how a plant that you may think is insignificant actually could serve a very important purpose, especially to humanity. And so, that's something where we get into things like the importance of the conservation of plant species, about how we have so many plant species that are considered endangered, and how we want to do our best to preserve them, because not only because it's the right thing to do to help our ecosystems, but also because they may be hiding the secret of, being medicinal in ways that could help with treatment of certain diseases. So, just something to kind of think about and to put in perspective here. So with that, our common little vinca has been used in the treatment of different cancers. Now, with that said, just like I mentioned in the previous slide, you should not consume this, okay? This is a very, very toxic plant. And in fact, consuming large quantities of this plant could make you very ill, okay? This is where, again, the compound that is extracted from this plant is used in medicine, but that doesn't mean that you can actually eat it safely, okay? In particular, this plant has what are called vinca alkaloids that could really cause a lot of damage to your organs. So just kind of, again, watch that. Just because I'm saying it's medicinal and it's used in certain ways does not mean you can eat it, okay? All right, rant over with that. All right, let's talk about another one that you all will probably notice every day as you walk outside, because it's fall, it's abundant. We see this growing in our garden beds. We see it being purchased in garden centers, at grocery stores, and that's our common chrysanthemum, okay? So chrysanthemum, they are originally from Asia, from different parts of Asia. And of course, now not only do we use it as a common ornamental plant, but for hundreds of years, this plant was actually used for different medicinal purposes. Commonly, it was even used to make a type of tea. It was extracted to make a type of tea. It was used for kind of helping to treat common ailments like flu or cold-like symptoms, sinus infections. But kind of going on, there's been some research done where it may provide some antioxidants, it might be anti-inflammatory in nature, and have even some anti-cancer properties in it. Some of you may even know chrysanthemums as a brilliant insect repellent because the chemical compound extracted from it is actually used as an insecticide, and that's pyrethrum. Okay, so that's kind of one of these more natural insecticides that we use that it does come from chrysanthemum flowers. So just something interesting to note there. So not only does it have some quality, some medicinal qualities, but it's also used in the industry as an insecticide too. All right. So on the left, you might know this plant. This little daisy-like plant is chamomile. Okay. And I'm kind of putting the scientific names on the bottom and where they're originating from. Specifically, this one is German chamomile. And I will say there are two types of chamomiles. There's a German chamomile and a Roman chamomile. The one that you most commonly drink as a tea is more than likely German chamomile that you're purchasing in the stores. The Roman chamomile is used, but it has a little bit more of a bitter taste. So people may not be as fond of it. But certainly this is a plant that you can grow. And the primary reason that you're growing this and using this as a type of tea is because it has very calming, soothing effects. Okay. It helps for people with stress, anxiety. It helps to the point where it can almost be used to treat kind of sleep ailments, where it can help people go off to sleep. And so you may have your cup of chamomile tea at night before you go to bed. So it really serves, a really great purpose for that. Now, one thing I do want to highlight though is with chamomile, this is in the Asteraceae family, the aster family. Now, for people, and I'll talk about this with our echinacea later on, for people that have severe ragweed allergies, okay? If you have severe ragweed, like ragweed's been growing, okay? If you are very sensitive to that, you need to be cautious when using any plants in the Asteraceae family as a type of herbal supplement. So that goes for things like chamomile, that goes for things like echinacea, where you could potentially have a reaction to that. Again, this is where I'm talking about why it's always good to seek medical guidance, because if you weren't aware of that or you didn't think your allergy was a big deal, but then you take the supplement and have a reaction, something to be mindful of. And so if you do have that sensitivity, you may not be able to drink chamomile tea as much as you may like. So just something to note there. On the right-hand side, this plant should be familiar to you. This is our peppermint, okay? And so we have different mints. The mint family itself is very medicinal in nature, and a lot of the mint family, the Lamiaceae family, is also used for culinary purposes. A lot of our standard herbs come from this family. And so with peppermint in particular, we use this as a tea. We may use this to garnish some of our meals. We may use this in some of our other drinks or in desserts. But one thing's for certain, the primary reason that you are growing peppermint or that you may incorporate it as a tea is probably the medicinal effects it has with aiding in digestion. Okay, so a lot of times if you have stomach ailments, or maybe you have bloating, things of that nature, this really helps to aid and kind of speed up the digestive process and help that indigestion. Something else that mint also is really good at, if you use mint in essential oils, it also helps to boost focus. So a lot of people, if they have a difficult time concentrating, they yet may use mint as an essential oil to help with that process. So one of the many, many reasons to use mint, and specifically peppermint. Other mints are used, but peppermint probably is one of the more popular ones. All right, common one. All of y'all know this one, right? Aloe vera. Okay, so our aloe. This is one of our common house plants, honestly, that we grow, and usually it forms so many millions of pups that we're trying to get rid of them and give them away to people. But aloe vera does serve an important purpose, where you can, cut open one of the thick leaves. This is a type of succulent, and you can use the sap, the juices that come from that leaf to help aid with burn treatments. And so, of course, whenever we have a horrific sunburn, we may be able to buy kind of an aloe vera gel that's in the market, but certainly if you have a plant, if you don't have any other kinds of like skin conditions or certain reactions, you may be able to actually cut open this plant and put it on your sunburn. So it definitely helps in treatments like that. And some people may even use aloe vera extract for other kind of internal stomach issues as well. So the other plant that I'll mention here, so this is going to look very much like, you're going to see this and you're like, is that ginger? Well, it's similar to ginger, but it's not ginger. This is turmeric, okay? And so a lot of times we may use turmeric as a type of spice to aid in some of our culinary cooking. But this not only serves culinary purposes, it's actually even used in a lot of cosmetics as well. But primarily the reason that you're either consuming it or adding it to, like, not a facial scrub, but you know what I'm saying, for different purposes, is because it's anti-inflammatory, it's antimicrobial, so it has antibacterial properties to it, and it has antioxidants. So it's very beneficial in those regards. A lot of times you don't want to, you want to consume turmeric in moderation. You don't want to have too much of it, or else you could potentially have some other side effects as well. But it is kind of closely related to that ginger. And unrelated, but we'll talk about a different type of ginger. All right. So before I get into, and I'm going to go more in depth with some of our native plants, because I know a lot of you are probably wanting to know more about the plants that we see in our woodlands and what kind of purposes that they serve. And so before I get into that, let me show you something. So I'm actually going to end the slideshow real quick and I'll go back to it, I promise. Okay. Okay. So I have a book here, and it's a field guide to medicinal wild plants, okay? Hopefully y'all can see that, all right? So this is a wonderful guide that talks about a lot of our native species. It does go in depth with other non-native species as well, but gives you really wonderful information on what are some of the common medicinal purposes these plants were used for, especially by Native American culture. And I will say, I have to kind of like shout out here, because I think there may be some newer additions. But I have to shout out the revisions that were done by a Dr. David Foster. Not to be biased here, but he was my advisor in my undergrad research study. So shout out to Dr. David Foster. And this is actually the book that he gave to me. And so you can purchase this book really through any of your typical booksellers, but this is just a wealth of knowledge with anything you can think of. So, and for those of you that are here in Hopkins County, of course, you're welcome to take a look at my book as well, and I can show it to you sometime. But it's called Field Guide to Medicinal Wild Plants. All right, let me go back to sharing my screen. All right. Okay. All right. So let's kind of focus in on some specific native plants. So these are the ones that we're going to be covering today. So let's kind of take a deep dive into them and what are some of their medicinal properties. All right. First one is bloodroot. So we've talked about bloodroot and some other classes, but this is an exceptionally beautiful spring ephemeral plant. It has that gorgeous scalloped leaf, and in the spring, early spring, sometimes even late winter, depending on kind of the winter conditions that we have, it will produce this lovely little white flower that has kind of that yellow center. Why it's called bloodroot is essentially if you were to wound really any part of this plant, it will secrete this reddish orange sap. And it actually was very commonly used as a dye by the Native Americans. But in particular, Native Americans also used the rootstock as well. Now, again, I feel like a broken record here. This is very toxic, okay? So this doesn't mean you can go and eat the rootstock and you're gonna get some of the good properties, okay? You gotta be careful. Even at low doses, this could cause problems. But what I will say is, Native Americans use this actually to help aid with problems with their teeth. So anything from problems that we have currently, like gingivitis, so any kind of issues with like swollen gums, to plaque, accumulation of plaque. It had anti-plaque properties to it. So it kind of helped to aid in some of those problems because, when you think about it, we did not really have any kind of dentists or dentistry work done hundreds of years ago. And so how did you keep your teeth from rotting, basically? And so they did find that this had those types of properties. But to be honest with you, this is not something really for modern day research is something that we would suggest continuing to do so, okay? Just kind of more of an interesting fact, if you will. All right. This is a big one, right? I think all of us can say we're familiar with echinacea. We have several different native purple cone flowers that are found in Kentucky. Now, the one that we think of most, especially for medicinal purposes, is Echinacea purpurea, okay? Our standard purple cone flower, all right, that we grow very much as a native meadow plant, native prairie plant, really great for pollinators, things of that nature. And something that you may have noticed is, especially if you go to kind of the herbal supplement part of a store, you're probably going to see echinacea labeled everywhere. And there is a reason for that. It is probably one of the most common nutritional supplements that we have. Primarily when it's used as a supplement, it's kind of prepared from the roots, but all parts of the plant, flowers, leaves, and seeds can be used for those purposes. Why is it used? Again, you're going to kind of see a trend with a lot of these plants. Anti-inflammatory properties, helps to stimulate and boost the immune system, even help aid in healing of wounds. And so even though we may use this more as a pill, you can also commonly see this in creams, powders, even a type of tea as well. And so again, primarily Echinacea purpurea is the main one that we're seeing for use in a supplement. And so with that plant, you know, from this picture here, you can see standard has those daisy-like purple cone flowers. This is a member of the Asteraceae family as well. So remember what I said about chamomile? It's the same thing. If you have a ragweed allergy, you need to be mindful if you're trying to take a supplement because you could have a reaction. Just to be on the safe side, okay? Again, talk to a medical professional about that. When it's not in bloom, though, it's known to have a very rough, coarse texture of the leaves, and oftentimes they're very hairy. Now, we have a lot of modern day cultivated varieties of Echinacea purpurea. This is specifically talking about the straight species, okay? I don't really know if any of the modern day cultivars or hybrids that are out there really have the same medicinal components to it. You know, it's kind of hard to say. And so more than likely the herbal supplements that you see are coming from the straight traditional species. I really don't think I could have had a medicinal botany class without mentioning elderberry, especially as its population has been pretty significant over the last few years because we have elderberry tea, elderberry syrup, different types of elderberry supplements. It's really kind of caught on. So we do have native elderberries. There's also non-native elderberries, but we do have native elderberry. Traditionally, it's a woody deciduous shrub. It likes moisture. It's usually found along kind of our streams, riverbeds, marsh areas, anywhere where there's quite a bit of moisture. You really can't miss it because it's kind of one of our few shrub species that have these very easy to recognize compound leaves, okay? And honestly, with that, it will form substantial thickets to the point where I'm not calling it a weed, not calling it a weed. I hate to call anything a weed. It's an aggressive grower. It's an aggressive spreader. And so if this is something that you may want to consider growing, whether for an ornamental or for medicinal purposes, just know you're going to need to leave it plenty of space, okay? In time, this plant will form these clusters of these beautiful little white flowers, but what you see after is the fruit. And this is a drupe fruit that is kind of more this purpley black color that appears really around this time right now. Now, before we get kind of into some of the medicinal purpose of it, let me be straight with you on consumption. It is not safe to consume the raw berries or if they are unripe. Okay? It is very toxic. It contains a compound that if you consume it, it will kind of degrade into a type of hydrogen cyanide. Okay. So, and with that hydrogen cyanide, you could experience things like vomiting, diarrhea, nausea, all the unpleasant situations. Okay. So this is not like a blueberry. This is not like a raspberry where you can just eat this raw. You cannot. Do not eat the raw unripe berries. That would be very, very bad. Okay. Let the berries ripen. And then from there, you can either let them dry, or what most people do is they will boil the berries. They will cook the berries. As long as you are cooking the berry you should be okay. It should help to remove kind of those more toxic compounds. Okay. Um, so what would you use this for? A lot of people like to make a tea, an elderberry tea, um, from the berries. Even for culinary purposes, you may like the taste of elderberry, and so you may cook the berries in different desserts, like pies or in jellies. That's what we kind of see quite a bit of. Um, just like with other so-called berries, if you will, they're almost like these little superfoods, all right? They're just a really good source of vitamins and minerals. In particular, elderberry is very high in vitamins A and C. And certainly if this is something you feel like you're lacking in your diet and you want to kind of supplement, that might be the option that you go with. Um, what people primarily use elderberry for, as a tea especially, or as a syrup, people use it as a syrup, is to help boost the immune system. People will take elderberry tea or elderberry syrup if they have a cold, if they have flu-like symptoms, to help with that. So certainly that might be something that even some of you have already done or used. One thing I will note, and this is kind of the case, I should have mentioned this with a lot of these plants. If you're using these as a tea or supplement, be mindful, especially if you're pregnant, because a lot of these are not safe to take while pregnant. Elderberry is one of those. You really shouldn't be consuming elderberry tea or syrup if you're pregnant. So just something to be mindful of. But this is definitely one of our more common native species that definitely gets a lot of hype right now in the medicinal department. Oh boy, is this another one? Ginseng. Oh my goodness, ginseng. Boy, is this a plant that is hard to find. And if you do find it, you don't need to tell anyone because it'll be gone the next day. This is a very prized plant. Okay. And so this is native. This ginseng grows well in kind of deep shaded woodland. A lot of times you're going to find it under different tree species, such as tulip poplar, black walnut, and sugar maple. How you can recognize it is that it has traditionally 3 to 5 leaflets. Okay. They're often pointy. You can kind of see how they're pointed at the end. The leaf margins are toothed. So they have that kind of serration to them. And then they're more elliptic to obovate in shape. Now, these can produce these kind of white, um, yellowish flowers, and they will give way to these gorgeous, vibrant red berries. Okay, very fragrant berries. Now, this plant has been for many years used for medicinal purposes, especially the root of this plant. Oftentimes, it's served as a tea, ginseng tea, powder, and pills used to treat, again, kind of your more flu-like cold symptoms, headaches, even stomach indigestion. Um, it's been known to help stop vomiting and stop convulsions. A lot of people may use it for some of those different reasons. Now, because of the nature of this plant, because it is so highly prized, we have a lot of issues with poaching, to say the least. This is a very well foraged plant to the point where it is not only becoming potentially threatened in its environment, but if you do find this plant and you tell somebody, someone may go and scoop it up because you can sell the dried root of this plant for a lot of money. Okay. That's why we have a lot of poachers, is because of how much money this plant's root can go for. Now, I have here $300 per pound. That's an old estimate. I guarantee you it may even be more than that. Um, and so you just have to be mindful of if you really are trying to preserve plant species, if you do find this in the woods, don't tell people. Don't tell people. So like I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and we went to a grower. Um, a grower, I don't want to give too much information away, but he was a grower of a certain plant species, and in his woodlands he had ginseng. And of course, he had to be very mindful of it because he had issues actually before with people coming and poaching the plants out of his woodlands. And so this is a very real thing. Um, and so maybe that's something to be mindful of. You may use ginseng for different purposes, like as a supplement, but just kind of be more appreciative in a way because this plant may be hard to come by, um, especially as it is being kind of taken away from its natural environment. So, um, of course, you may have ginseng growers that are actually cultivating this plant for those particular purposes. But even with that, we still have a lot of poaching issues. Golden seal. So golden seal um, is another one of our species. You may even have it in your garden, especially if you're an avid native plant person. This is a good shade plant. It has these beautiful palmately lobed leaves, so kind of has that kind of hand palmate shape to it. Um, the leaves are very textured, okay, very textured, have almost this like wrinkled appearance to them. So when it's mature, you'll have kind of this two-leaved flower stalk that comes, and it will produce a white flower. It's actually apetalous in nature, meaning it does not have any petals. So what you see there, the white part, are actually the reproductive organs of the flower. So more than likely, kind of the stamen, the anthers, the male pollinating parts of that flower. And so when this flower is pollinated, it will eventually give way to red berries. Now, as with other things, all parts of this plant are poisonous in large doses. Primarily, it's used for medicinally for the rootstock. Okay, so it has this rootstock and these really pretty yellow rhizomes. And you can kind of cut those rhizomes and easily propagate them. And it's a good spreader. It's a good spreader in that regard in your garden bed. What is the rootstock used for? Oh my goodness, many things. Many things. And you have probably seen this marketed all over the place as a supplement for different types of treatments. Um, this is a plant that's been researched in the treatment of the AIDS virus, as well as in cancer research as well. But primarily when we're using it as a supplement, it helps to aid in different digestive issues, kind of immune health, antibiotic purposes. Um, a lot of times it's also used as a type of tonic to increase activity, increase kind of alertness. And then even people may have used it to help with liver health, as well as any kind of like congestion, especially like kind of bronchial congestion that you may experience. Kind of an interesting other fun fact with this plant, this is kind of a super plant, you know, for all the medicinal properties it has. You know, again, you know, underappreciated for all the cool things that it does. Um, Back when we had more of that pandemic of smallpox, so the smallpox virus, this plant was actually used to help speed up the healing process of smallpox. So it helped with the healing of those open sores that the victims would experience. So again, something that may have been used kind of more widely years ago, but is still serving purposes even now. So, you know, I definitely, this is one of those plants that I see when I see it growing, you have to definitely appreciate it for all the purposes that it serves. Jewelweed. I love jewelweed, okay? Because this is kind of like one of the first plants that really made me think about medicinal botany and like using native plants and what different purposes that they served. Again, I'm not, even though it has weed in its name, I hate to call anything a weed, but it is a very uh, aggressive grower as well. Commonly, you'll see this in our woodlands and more moist areas. It's found in a lot of moist soil around our forests, our stream banks. If you go up to Audubon State Park, there's a very healthy population of jewelweed on one of their lake trails there. So, um, with jewelweed, if you kind of look at the flower and you're like, why does this kind of look familiar? So this is related to our impatiens that we grow. They're somewhat closely related, and so it has a very similar flower. And so if you look at our standard bedding plant impatiens, the jewelweed is also kind of a type of impatiens, if you will. So it's actually in that genus. So very kind of cool aspect about that. Um, so what does this plant look like? So it's kind of this broad type plant. It very, it doesn't have really a good shape, if you will. Um, it has these alternate leaf structure with these serrated margins, really fuzzy undersides. And so really the plant is pretty nondescript, if you will. When you don't see it bloom, you may not actually even pay attention to it very much. But again, around this time of the year, you will actually see this plant in bloom and it's producing these really pretty orange and yellow flowers. And they usually have these kind of darker orange splotches on them. And I quite like the flower. I think it's lovely. Um, there may even be like a cultivar out there with a different color to it as well. Not that it's widely in cultivation, but you may just have it growing if you have kind of wet woodland areas. Um, Really good pollinator plant. Hummingbirds love this plant and will flock to it for as a nectar source. It's an aggressive spreader because it self-seeds very easily. It has the seed capsule that pops open for easy dispersion. So that's why you kind of see a lot of it in different places. Now, what was this used for? Well, primarily it was used by the Native Americans to help relieve itching. This is like a very common remedy to help stop the itching of poison ivy. Okay. And so we even have some people locally that use jewelweed extract to help aid um, with poison ivy treatment. And so they would extract the different plant juices, Native Americans would, and they would use it in treating not only poison ivy, but any kind of insect bites, stinging nettle. Not, we have a lot of stinging nettle in Pennsylvania, for sure, but different areas of the country that may have that. And what you're doing is essentially you are crushing the leaves and the stem of this plant, and then you might be able to even apply it directly. Or you can kind of extract that and use it and make a type of ointment, if you will. Now, I will say though, something to be mindful of, like it may not be the best idea to just directly crush the leaves and use them on your kind of skin rash. Sometimes there may be bacteria on the plant material. And so if you want to reduce potentially like infection just from putting the plant material directly on your wound, if you will, you may want to blanch the plant material first, and that'll help reduce infection. Just because, again, sometimes we may have bacteria that are on the foliage, things of that nature. But this is a very common plant and one that I still see people use all the time for their poison ivy. Boy, do I use this for poison ivy, and it helps. It really helps stop that awful, awful, terrible itching. All right. May apple. This is another one that you're going to see in our woodlands. This is, one of those that you see kind of start to pop up in the early spring with its beautiful little umbrella shaped leaves just kind of fold out and come out. You'll see lovely large colonies of this in the wild. It spreads very easily by rhizomes. Now, it has kind of this palmate shaped leaf. If it just has one leaf, that's kind of an immature plant. If it has two leaves, then that plant is usually mature and will produce a flower. But only the two-leaved plants are going to produce the flower. The one leaf will not. So they'll produce kind of this kind of nodding bell flower, white flower. And it has kind of those white petals and those yellow reproductive parts. Eventually, that flower is going to give way to a greenish fruit, and that fruit is edible when that fruit is ripe. Okay, you don't want to eat it when it's not ripe. It'll turn more of a golden yellow color, and that's when you'll know you can actually use it. Okay, but don't eat it while it's still really green. Okay. So, what are some of the purposes of this plant? Now, other than the edible fruit, most of this plant is quite toxic, so you do want to watch that. But some of the compounds have been extracted and used for cancer-fighting properties. So the root itself, the mayapple root, actually, the resin that comes from the root was used to help remove skin tumors, skin cancer tumors. So kind of an interesting aspect of that. And additionally, a lot of times Native Americans may have used the root as a type of tea. They would steep the root in tea, in water. They would steep it in water. And they would use it to help with digestive issues, especially like if there was a digestive parasite, some type of worm, parasitic worm. It would help to expel the worms from the digestive tract. Um, they also use this plant in the treatment of things like arthritis, help with treating snake bites. So this plant served many different purposes and kind of its history. Now, with that, again, this plant is poisonous, so you can't just eat it. And also, you have to watch too with some of the properties of this plant. It can be kind of labeled as a type of narcotic, so you have to watch that. And also, it is very much a diuretic too. So some very unpleasant trees associated with this plant too. But just again, something else, you're walking in the woodlands, you're seeing this plant so commonly, and it's like you may not even realize all the different purposes that it served. It's very unique and wonderful in that regard. Let's talk about a woody plant. Let's talk about slippery elm. Again, this is another plant that's found in a lot of our moist areas, our moist woodlands. It has, you kind of think of typical elm-shaped leaves, these broad leaves with these coarse teeth. This one has little reddish hairy buds, And eventually the plant will have these small, really insignificant, if you will, greenish flowers, probably pretty inconspicuous, honestly. But those will give way to a seed pod that's single seeded and kind of round shaped, but that you can see in that bottom picture. Now, with this plant, traditionally, this was used by Native Americans. The bark was primarily used. So it has almost this very heavy the mucilaginous bark, if you will. And that was extracted to treat different things. Again, kind of more flu-like symptoms, sore throat, but also was helpful with treating fevers and even wound care. So what was interesting with this is Native Americans would use this bark to help with gunshot wounds. Okay, so of course, when we had um, the United States being colonized, and there were unfortunate conflicts between the colonists and the Native Americans. Of course, those conflicts may have resulted in the use of weapons like guns, and so those gunshot wounds that the Native Americans may have experienced to help kind of ease that area and even help with the removal of the bullet itself, of that lead bullet. They would use slippery elm to help treat those wounds in that injured skin. Um, so you can see it's kind of, again, a multi-use plant where, oh, I'm treating it for a common cold, but I'm also treating it even for some open wounds or gunshot wounds, things like that. So very interesting how a plant over time can then serve multiple purposes. All right. Wild ginger. So I told you we were going to talk about another ginger. Now, this is not our culinary ginger, not even closely related to it, but it is wild ginger, and this is one of our natives. It's called wild ginger because it has very fragrant roots that almost smell like culinary ginger, and actually you could even use it to flavor foods. So you could almost treat it like a type of ginger. But this is a common ground cover here in Kentucky. It's actually a great ornamental ground cover, especially if you need areas around trees where maybe you can't get grass to grow. It's perfect for that type of situation. So these have these lovely kind of kidney shaped leaves. It's very low growing and has a very small and often insignificant flower. I think it's cool personally, but very low to the ground. It has this flower that's kind of cup shaped. You can kind of see by this bottom picture here. It has three pointed flower lobes, and it's kind of a purpley brown color. It blooms near the ground um, because they kind of suspect that there might be certain pollinators, like say beetles or things like that, that might help to pollinate this plant. So some type of insect that is usually on ground level and able to go in there and pollinate it. Oftentimes too, a lot of plants that usually have that purple brown color, sometimes they kind of gives the effect of like meat or like flesh. And so sometimes that even attracts things like flies or other types of insects as well. But with this plant, it spreads by a rhizome. And that underground rhizome is usually what is kind of serving the medicinal purpose, that rhizome, that root stock, if you will, kind of used interchangeably here. Um, it helps as an antiseptic. It helps with the aid of indigestion, which is, again, even though it's not culinary ginger, kind of similar to ginger because we think of ginger as helping with digestive problems as well. But also, even this plant helps to alleviate cold-like symptoms as well as to help reduce fevers. So primarily used for those types of things. All right. I'm actually not doing bad on time. I'm kind of shocked at myself. So let's kind of finish this last one here, and that is witch hazel. So another lovely small tree. Um, this it's pretty nondescript too. A lot of people may overlook witch hazel until it's in bloom. But it has these oval obovate leaves with kind of a wavy margin, and it does have some lovely fall color. Usually turns a nice, pretty yellow color in the fall. What's interesting is it will produce flowers usually when nothing else is blooming. It's usually blooming when everything else is dormant. So whether that's going into fall or winter, kind of depending on where you are in the United States, this plant is going to bloom when everything else is probably dead. And so it is these really pretty fragrant yellow flowers. They're four petaled. It can kind of be hard to tell with that, but they're very crinkly and ribbon shaped. And usually these flowers are not coming on until after the leaves of this plant have already dropped for the season. Eventually, these flowers are going to give way to the fruit. So there's these little greenish seed capsules. Once they're mature, they are going to quite literally explode and disperse the black seeds. So that's how it is able to disperse across different areas. Now, you may see this plant quite commonly used as an herbal supplement. It's pretty well out there on the market. It's pretty common, if you will. So different parts of the plant are used for different medicinal purposes, but the ones that you most likely see are the leaves, bark, and twigs. Anti-inflammatory. It helps in any kind of skin irritations. It helps aid in insect bites. So situations like that. A lot of times people may have used a tea extract used to make a tea with witch hazel, usually from the leaves or the bark. And a lot of times that helped aid in the use of stomach ailments. So even people swear to it for helping to treat stomach bleeding or stomach ulcers, things of that nature. So again, a plant that you actually do commonly see more in the trade, that is a native plant species that we have around here. So very, very cool plant. And so with that, I really hope with this presentation, this helped you all to kind of see not only some of the plants we talked about, internationally, but a lot of our plants right here at home and the different purposes that they served. Quite honestly, plants are incredible. What they are able to produce, and then how humans have been able to, over the period of hundreds to thousands of years, been able to figure out these different medicinal purposes is quite extraordinary, honestly. And again, even though we have modern day medicine, we have a lot of synthetic drugs, we have a lot of different other types of treatment of some of these ailments. Still, some of these plants are prevalent even now, or some of our, again, modern day drugs kind of originated from these plants. So it's very interesting and a really good history. And so if that's something like you really want to kind of dive into, you should, because medicinal botany is quite an extraordinary and interesting topic to research. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.